August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves throughout Japan, announcing surrender for the first time in the nation's history. But for 32 Japanese women being transported across the Pacific Ocean in the hull of an American military vessel, that voice never reached them. They learned of their country's defeat not through imperial decree, but through the silence of their captors and the way American sailors no longer looked at them with the sharp edge of active warfare in their eyes. Among them was 24-year-old Masako Kimura, a communications specialist from Osaka who had served with the Women's Volunteer Corps in the Philippines. She sat with her back pressed against the cold metal wall of the ship, her hands folded in her lap with the rigid discipline that had been drilled into her since she first donned her gray auxiliary uniform. Around her, the other women maintained similar postures of controlled dignity, though Masako could see the fear flickering behind their carefully neutral expressions. They had been captured 3 weeks earlier as American forces swept through Manila in the final chaotic days of the Pacific Campaign. The women had been working as radio operators, translators, and medical assistants, supporting Japanese military operations from what they believed was a safe distance from combat. That illusion shattered when American troops surrounded their compound. Masako had expected immediate execution. Everything she had been taught about American brutality had prepared her for death. Instead, the Americans had separated the women from male prisoners, searched them efficiently but without violence, and loaded them onto trucks. The confusion of being alive when she expected to be dead had been almost worse than the fear itself. Sumiko Ando, a 21-year-old medical assistant from Kyoto, had been unable to eat for days. Hisako Matsuda, at 27, the oldest among them and a former administrative officer from Tokyo, maintained an appearance of stoic strength, but Masako had seen her hands trembling. Even 19-year-old Terako Saito, whose youthful face still carried traces of the optimistic girl she had been before the war, now wore an expression of resigned despair. The propaganda they had consumed for years painted a terrifying picture of capture by Americans, especially for women. Stories of unspeakable brutality, of torture and degradation, better to die fighting than fall into enemy hands, their instructors had emphasized repeatedly. The ship's engines changed pitch, signaling their approach to port. Whatever was going to happen to them would begin soon. When American sailors came to escort them above deck, Masako was struck by how young many of them looked. The California sunlight hit her eyes with painful brightness after weeks in the dim cargo hold. The women were loaded into covered military trucks. The journey lasted several hours, winding, roads suggesting they were moving inland. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas back was pulled open, Masako saw a small facility surrounded by chain-link fencing. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the compound looked nothing like the hellish prisons she had imagined. Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The women were led into a processing building where Captain Frances Holbrook stood waiting. She was a tall woman in her mid-30s with steel-gray eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was crisp despite the California heat, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. But when she spoke, her voice carried none of the harshness Masako had expected. "Welcome to Camp Fremont," she said in clear, measured English. A younger woman beside her, wearing a chaplain's insignia, began translating into careful Japanese. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and respect." The translation hung in the air like an impossible promise. Masako glanced at Sumiko, whose face remained carefully blank. They had discussed this possibility during the voyage, the idea that Americans might use kind words before the cruelty began. It was a test, they decided, or perhaps psychological torture, designed to make the eventual brutality more devastating. The women were assigned to a barracks that shocked them with its relative comfort. Metal frame beds with actual mattresses, thin but clean blankets, windows that opened to let in fresh air. It was sparse but nothing like the crowded, filthy conditions they had imagined. That first evening, they were served dinner in a communal hall. American soldiers brought trays of food, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and white bread with butter. The portions were generous, almost obscenely so compared to the rations they had survived on during the final months of the war in the Philippines. The women stared at their trays with deep suspicion. "It's poisoned," Hisako whispered in Japanese. "They're fattening us up before the slaughter," Sumiko added, her voice trembling. "Or the food itself will kill us." Masako looked down at her tray. The aroma was rich and unfamiliar, triggering hunger she had been suppressing for weeks. But the fear was stronger. Not one of the 32 women touched their food that first night. Private Merle Hutchinson, a lanky young man from New Mexico assigned to guard duty, noticed their untouched trays. He had kind eyes and a face that looked like it smiled easily, though tonight he seemed troubled by the women's obvious distress. He approached their table slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. Understanding they spoke no English, he picked up a fork from an empty place setting and took a bite from his own identical meal. He chewed, swallowed, and smiled, gesturing to their plates with an encouraging nod. The women watched him with wide eyes. He took another bite, then another, his expression suggesting this was the most natural thing in the world. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, showing them a picture of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. "My wife," he said, pointing to the photo, then to himself. "Maria." He spoke her name with such tenderness that something shifted in the air. Teruko, the youngest, reached out slowly and picked up her fork. 3 days passed before the women began to trust the food enough to eat more than a few cautious bites. 3 days of watching American soldiers consume identical meals, 3 days of Private Hutchinson's patient encouragement, 3 days of their bodies weakening from self-imposed starvation born of fear. Captain Holbrook had grown concerned enough to request Nurse Hazel Pritchard examine each woman for signs of dangerous weight loss. But on the 4th morning, something changed that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. Sergeant Vernon O'Neill had been watching the women struggle with meals from his position overseeing the kitchen operations. A thick-set man in his 40s with graying hair and a pronounced Chicago accent, he had spent 20 years in the Army and had seen his share of suffering. These women reminded him of his own daughters, young and far from home, trapped in circumstances beyond their control. He decided to try something unorthodox. That afternoon, he appeared in the mess hall carrying a tray with 8 tall glasses filled with a thick, pale brown liquid topped with white foam. The women looked up from their barely touched lunch plates as he approached their table. He set the tray down gently and gestured to the glasses. "Chocolate shake," he announced, speaking slowly and clearly. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he lifted one glass and took a long drink through a striped paper straw, closing his eyes with exaggerated pleasure. Masako stared at the beverage with confusion and suspicion. The glasses were frosted with condensation, suggesting they were cold, an almost unimaginable luxury. The brown liquid looked impossibly rich and thick. She had never seen anything like it. O'Neill pushed a glass toward Teruko, the youngest, whose curiosity had always been stronger than her fear. He mimed drinking again, his expression encouraging. Slowly, hesitantly, Teruko reached for the glass. It was cold against her palms, shockingly so. She looked at Masako, seeking permission, or perhaps courage. Masako gave a small nod. If this was poisoned, if this was how they would die, at least they would face it together. Teruko brought the straw to her lips and took a small sip. Her eyes went wide, not with pain or fear, but with absolute shock. The taste that flooded her mouth was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Sweet, impossibly sweet, but also rich and creamy, with an undertone of something dark and slightly bitter that she would later learn was chocolate. She had tasted chocolate once before the war, a small piece her father had brought from Tokyo, but nothing like this abundance, this overwhelming generosity of flavor. A sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob. She took another sip, then another, her hands trembling as she gripped the glass. The other women watched her face transform from suspicion to wonder. One by one, they reached for their own glasses. Sumiko's thin hands shook as she brought the straw to her lips. When the taste hit her, tears began streaming down her face. The chocolate shakes became a turning point that none of the women could have anticipated. In the days that followed, Sergeant O'Neill made it his personal mission to introduce them to American food in all its bewildering variety. Each meal brought new confusion and wonder. Hamburgers with melted cheese, French fries with ketchup, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, fried chicken with biscuits and gravy. The women struggled to reconcile these offerings with everything they had been taught about their enemies. Masako found herself keeping a mental catalog of these contradictions. The propaganda had spoken endlessly of America's poverty, of a nation starving and desperate, willing to commit any atrocity to steal resources from Asia. Yet here was food in quantities she had never seen, even before the war. White bread appeared at every meal, not the carefully rationed luxury it had been in Japan, but casually abundant. Butter, sugar, milk, meat, all served without apparent concern for scarcity. It made no sense. Either everything they had been told was a lie, or this abundance was somehow an elaborate deception designed for purposes she could not fathom. Private Hutchinson had begun teaching basic English during mealtimes, pointing to objects and speaking their names slowly. Fork, spoon, bread, water. The women repeated the words hesitantly, their tongues struggling with unfamiliar sounds. But it was the food vocabulary that stuck most readily: chocolate, hamburger, ice cream. These words represented experiences so powerful they seemed to bypass the normal process of language learning and embed themselves directly into memory. Teruko proved to have a natural gift for languages. Within 2 weeks, she could string together simple sentences. "This good," she would say, pointing to her plate. "Thank you." Her willingness to engage encouraged the others. Hisako, despite her initial resistance, found herself drawn to the kitchen where Sergeant O'Neill worked. She began observing the cooking processes with the same careful attention she had once applied to administrative duties. The scale of American cooking fascinated her. Industrial mixers, massive ovens, refrigeration units that could preserve food for weeks. O'Neill noticed her interest and began allowing her into the kitchen during preparation times, teaching her the names of ingredients and techniques: flour, yeast, baking. His patience reminded her of her father, who had taught her calligraphy with the same quiet encouragement. One evening, O'Neill prepared a special dessert, chocolate cake with thick frosting. He brought a large slice to each woman, watching their faces as they took their first bites. Sumiko, who had been the most reluctant to eat anything, found herself transported by the sweetness. She had grown up in modest circumstances in Kyoto, where such luxuries were unimaginable even in peacetime. The cake was moist and rich, the frosting sweet enough to make her teeth ache, and yet she could not stop eating. When she finished, she looked up at O'Neill and spoke one of the few English phrases she had learned. "More, please." The sergeant laughed, a warm, booming sound, and brought her another slice. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in how Sumiko understood the world. October brought cooler weather to California, and with it, news from across the Pacific that would shatter whatever fragile peace the women had begun to construct. The International Red Cross had finally established reliable communication channels with occupied Japan, and the American command at Camp Fremont began the process of helping prisoners contact their families. Captain Holbrook called the women together in the common room to explain the procedure. Through Father Paul Nakano, a Japanese-American chaplain who had begun visiting the camp weekly, she told them they could write letters that would be forwarded through Red Cross channels. The response might take weeks or months, but eventually they should hear something about their families. Masako sat at a small wooden table that evening, a piece of paper and pencil before her, trying to compose a letter to her parents in Osaka. How did one begin such a letter? How did she explain that she was alive, that she was well, that she was being treated with unexpected kindness by the very enemies they had been taught to hate? How could she write about chocolate shakes and apple pie when she had no idea if her family even had rice to eat? She started and discarded 3 attempts before finally writing the simplest version she could manage. I am alive. I am safe. I am in California. I pray you are well. Please write. The inadequacy of these words felt crushing. Over the following weeks, the women waited with increasing anxiety for responses that mostly never came. Father Nakano brought what news he could gather about conditions in Japan. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities had been reduced to ash by American firebombing campaigns. Hiroshima and Nagasaki existed now only as names synonymous with atomic horror. Millions were homeless, starving, struggling to survive in a country that had been utterly defeated and occupied by foreign forces. The infrastructure that might have delivered letters had largely ceased to exist. Teruko was the first to receive news, though it came not through a letter, but through Red Cross casualty reports. Her entire family in Hiroshima had been killed in the atomic bombing on August 6th. Father Nakano delivered this information privately, sitting with her in the chapel while she processed the reality that everyone she had ever loved was simply gone. She did not cry at first. The grief was too vast, too absolute for tears. She simply sat in silence, staring at her hands. When Masako found her hours later, still sitting in the same position, Teruko spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. There is nothing to go home to. My home does not exist anymore. Sumiko received a letter 6 weeks after sending hers. It was from a neighbor, not family. The single page informed her that her parents and younger sister had died during the firebombing of Kyoto. Her brother's fate was unknown. The neighbor apologized for being unable to provide more information and asked if Sumiko could send food if possible. The casual request at the end, as if she were simply away on a trip rather than imprisoned on the other side of the Pacific, made Sumiko laugh bitterly. November brought American newspapers to Camp Fremont, and with them, images that would haunt the women for the rest of their lives. Captain Holbrook had debated whether to allow the prisoners access to news coverage of Japan's defeat and occupation, but ultimately decided that truth, however painful, was better than ignorance. She arranged for Father Nakano to be present when she distributed newspapers featuring photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images were grainy, black and white, but their message was devastatingly clear. Entire cities reduced to flattened wasteland stretching to the horizon. Survivors with burns covering their bodies, their clothing burned into their skin. Children wandering through rubble, searching for parents who would never be found. The mushroom clouds themselves, rising like monuments to humanity's capacity for destruction. Masako sat in the common room, a newspaper spread before her, unable to look away from a photograph of a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing alone in the ruins of Hiroshima. The child's face was blank with shock, her dress torn and filthy, one arm wrapped in crude bandages. The caption explained that she had been orphaned by the blast, that thousands of children like her now wandered the devastated cities. Masako's hands began to shake. She had known abstractly that the atomic bombs had been dropped, had heard the basic facts, but seeing this child's face made it real in a way that mere words could never accomplish. This was what her country's war had ultimately produced. This was the future that had been stolen from an entire generation. Hisako found another article describing the extent of conventional bombing damage to Japanese cities. The statistics were almost incomprehensible. Over 60 cities bombed, millions homeless, hundreds of thousands dead. Tokyo's firebombing alone had killed more people in a single night than died in many entire battles. She read about people boiling grass to survive, about children selling their bodies for food, about the complete collapse of everything that had once seemed permanent and unshakable, about Japanese society. The newspaper slipped from her fingers as she tried to process the scale of suffering, but it was Teruko who found the article that changed everything. Buried in the back pages of one newspaper was a piece about the discovery of Japanese biological warfare experiments in China. Unit 731, it was called. The article described human experimentation, deliberate infection of civilians with plague and cholera, vivisection performed without anesthesia. The journalist's language was careful, almost clinical, but the implications were horrifying. Teruko carried the newspaper to where Masako and the others sat. She pointed to the article with a trembling finger, unable to speak. As the women read, a terrible silence fell over the room. This was different from learning about military defeats or even atomic devastation. This was evidence that their own country, the nation they had served with pride, had committed atrocities that rivaled anything they had accused their enemies of doing. The moral clarity they had once possessed, the certainty that they had been fighting for a righteous cause, crumbled completely. What kind of nation had they been serving? What kind of people had they been? The revelations from the newspapers left the women in a state of profound moral crisis. For days they moved through their routines mechanically, speaking little even to each other. The Americans at Camp Fremont noticed the change but seemed uncertain how to respond. It was Sergeant O'Neill who finally broke through the wall of silence that had descended over the compound. He arrived at the mess hall one evening with ingredients for a cooking lesson, gesturing for Hisako and any others who were interested to join him in the kitchen. Cooking, he seemed to understand, was a language that transcended words and politics and the weight of historical guilt. Hisako followed him reluctantly, with Masako and Sumiko trailing behind. O'Neill had laid out flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and vanilla extract. Tonight, he announced through gestures and the few Japanese words he had learned, "We make cookies." He demonstrated the process of creaming butter and sugar, his large hands working the mixture with surprising gentleness. He invited Hisako to try, guiding her hands with patience when she struggled with the unfamiliar technique. There was something profoundly healing about the simple act of creation, of making something sweet and good when everything else felt broken beyond repair. As they worked, O'Neill spoke to them in English, not expecting them to understand every word, but maintaining a steady stream of gentle conversation that somehow made the silence less oppressive. Private Hutchinson had been teaching English more formally now, holding classes 3 times a week in the common room. The women's language skills had improved dramatically, driven by a desperate need to understand and be understood. Teruko, despite her devastating loss, had thrown herself into learning with fierce determination. She practiced constantly, speaking to anyone who would listen, making mistakes without embarrassment. One afternoon, she approached Hutchinson after class with a question that had been weighing on her. "Why you kind to us?" she asked in halting English. "We are enemy. You should hate us." Hutchinson was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer in words she would understand. He pulled out the photograph of his wife again, the one he had shown them that first terrible night. "Maria's parents," he began slowly, "come from Mexico. When we got married, some people, very angry, they say she not belong here, say terrible things to her." He paused, searching for simpler words. "I learned that hate is easy. Kind is harder, but better. You not my enemy. You just person, like me, like Maria. War make us enemies, but war is finished now." The conversation spread through the women like ripples in water. If their captors could choose kindness over hatred, could choose to see them as individuals rather than symbols of an enemy nation, what did that mean about everything they had believed? Father Nakano's weekly visits had evolved into counseling sessions where the women grappled with questions that had no easy answers. He understood their struggle in ways the other Americans could not. His own family had been imprisoned in an internment camp for Japanese Americans earlier in the war, held by their own government simply because of their ancestry. December 15, 1945. Captain Holbrook received official orders from the War Department regarding the repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war. Transportation would be arranged through January and February of the following year. The women at Camp Fremont would be processed and returned to Japan by the end of winter. She called an assembly in the main hall, asking Father Nakano to translate as she delivered the news. The 32 women sat in rows of chairs, their faces reflecting complex emotions that went far beyond simple relief at the prospect of going home. "Ladies," Captain Holbrook began, her voice carrying the formal tone of official pronouncements, "I have received orders regarding your repatriation. You will be returned to Japan beginning in January. The Red Cross will assist with transportation, and you will be processed through facilities in Yokohama before being released." She paused, watching their faces as Father Nakano translated. What she expected was gratitude, perhaps tears of joy, maybe even celebration. What she saw instead was fear and uncertainty that seemed to deepen with every word. When she finished and opened the floor for questions, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Masako stood. Her English had improved enough that she could speak directly without translation, though she chose her words carefully. "Captain Holbrook, may I ask what happens if someone does not wish to return immediately?" The question hung in the air like an impossible proposition. Holbrook's expression shifted from official formality to genuine confusion. "I don't understand. You're saying someone would want to remain here? In a prison camp?" Masako glanced back at the other women. Sumiko was staring at her hands. Teruko met her gaze and gave a small nod of encouragement. Hisako's face was unreadable, but her posture suggested she had been expecting this moment. "We have been talking," Masako continued, her voice growing steadier. "Some of us have no family to return to. Some of us have learned things about our country that make us question who we were, what we believed. Here, in this place, we have found something we did not expect." She struggled to find the English words for what she wanted to express. "We have found that we can be different people than we were before." Captain Holbrook sat down slowly, recognizing that this conversation was going to be far more complicated than she had anticipated. "How many of you feel this way?" she asked. 11 women stood up. Teruko, whose entire family had been killed in Hiroshima. Sumiko, who had lost everyone in Kyoto. Hisako, who had received no word from Tokyo and assumed the worst. 8 others whose reasons were equally devastating, equally personal. They stood together, their decision clearly made, after weeks of private discussions among themselves. The women who remained seated looked at those standing with expressions ranging from understanding to betrayal. This divide, this fundamental disagreement about what they owed to their destroyed homeland, had been building for weeks. One of the seated women, a radio operator named Akiko, stood to challenge them. "You would abandon Japan?" she asked in Japanese, her voice sharp with accusation. "When our country needs us most, you would choose comfort and safety with the enemy?" Masako turned to face her, responding in Japanese so all could understand. "I am not choosing comfort. I am choosing the chance to become someone who can live with herself." The announcement divided the women in ways that went deeper than simple disagreement about logistics. Those who had chosen to stay and those who had chosen to return found themselves on opposite sides of a philosophical chasm that no amount of shared experience could bridge. Yet in the weeks that followed, something remarkable emerged from this division. Rather than descending into bitterness and recrimination, the women began to understand that both choices required courage, that both paths forward carried their own form of redemption. Akiko, who had spoken so sharply against those who wished to stay, approached Masako 3 days after the assembly. They sat together in the common room, speaking quietly in Japanese while snow fell outside the windows. "I spoke in anger," Akiko admitted, her voice softer now. "I was frightened by your choice because it made me question my own." Masako reached across the space between them and took her hand. "You are choosing to return and help rebuild what was destroyed. That is not a lesser choice than mine. It may be the braver one." The women who had decided to return began preparing for their journey with a sense of purpose that had been absent before. They were not simply going home in defeat. They were returning as witnesses to the possibility of reconciliation, carrying with them proof that former enemies could become friends. Father Nakano helped them compose letters to various organizations in Japan, explaining their experiences and offering their services in rebuilding efforts. Several planned to work with organizations helping orphaned children. Others hoped to find positions with groups facilitating Japanese-American relations during the occupation. Meanwhile, Captain Holbrook worked tirelessly to arrange proper immigration status for the 11 who wished to remain. The legal challenges were substantial. They were still technically enemy prisoners of war, and the framework for allowing them to stay did not exist. She wrote countless letters to superior officers, to immigration officials, to congressmen. She argued that these women represented exactly the kind of transformation that America's stated goals in the Pacific War had been meant to achieve. To send them back against their wishes would betray the very principles the nation claimed to be fighting for. Sergeant O'Neill took it upon himself to find local families willing to sponsor the women who would stay. He began with his own church in nearby Sacramento, speaking to the congregation about the women he had come to know over the past months. His description of Hisako's dedication to learning American cooking, of Taruko's resilience despite losing everything, of Masako's quiet dignity and growing English fluency, moved several families to volunteer as sponsors. Mrs. Edith Bannister, a school teacher and widow whose own son had died in the Pacific, surprised everyone by offering to sponsor 2 women herself. The women who were staying began a crash course in American civilian life. Mrs. Bannister visited the camp weekly, teaching them about everything from how to use telephones to navigating public transportation to understanding American currency. These practical lessons were interspersed with cultural education about customs, holidays, and social expectations. The learning curve was steep and often frustrating, but the women approached it with the same determination they had once applied to serving their country in war. On January 20th, 1946, the day came for the 21 women to depart for repatriation. 25 years after that cold January morning, when Japanese women prisoners made choices that would define the rest of their lives, Masako Kimura stood in the kitchen of her small home in Sacramento, teaching her teenage daughter how to make chocolate shakes. The recipe was the same one Sergeant O'Neill had used that afternoon in 1945 when everything changed. Her daughter, born in America and named Emily after Captain Holbrook's middle name, had heard the story countless times, but never tired of asking her mother to tell it again. "Mom," Emily said as she measured chocolate syrup into the blender, "do you ever regret staying?" Masako was quiet for a moment, watching her daughter work with the easy confidence of someone who had never known war or displacement or the soul-crushing weight of choosing between 2 impossible futures. "How could I regret the choice that gave me you?" she finally answered. "But it was more than that. I regret many things about the war, about the person I was, about what my country did. But staying here allowed me to become someone I could respect. Returning would have meant living with ghosts I was not ready to face." The 21 women who had returned to Japan in 1946 had faced challenges Masako could scarcely imagine. They arrived in Yokohama to find a country utterly transformed by defeat and occupation. The Japan they had left no longer existed, replaced by something strange and unfamiliar. Yet letters over the years revealed that they too had found their paths to meaning and redemption. Akiko had become a teacher, working with orphaned children in Osaka. She wrote every year at New Year's, her letters full of stories about her students and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a nation's soul. "We are planting gardens in the rubble," she had written in one letter, teaching children that beauty can grow from ash. Sumiko, who had stayed in America, had become a nurse at Sacramento General Hospital. She married a Japanese-American veteran who had served in the 442nd Regiment, men who had fought for America, while their own families were imprisoned in internment camps. Their shared understanding of what it meant to be caught between two nations, to be viewed with suspicion by both, had formed the foundation of a marriage that lasted 40 years. She still made cookies using Sergeant O'Neill's recipe, teaching the technique to younger nurses who never suspected their gentle colleague had once been an enemy prisoner of war. Teruko had taken the hardest path of all. She had stayed in America, but had eventually returned to Japan in 1955 to help establish a memorial for atomic bomb victims in Hiroshima. She never married, dedicating her life instead to peace advocacy and reconciliation work. She traveled between America and Japan constantly, serving as a living bridge between former enemies. Her English, once halting and uncertain, became flawless. Her ability to speak about forgiveness and transformation moved audiences on both sides of the Pacific. Hisako had stayed in America and eventually opened a small restaurant in Sacramento that served both Japanese and American food. Her fusion approach was ahead of its time, criticized by purists on both sides, but beloved by a growing clientele who appreciated her philosophy that the best aspects of different cultures could coexist on the same plate. She employed both Japanese immigrants and American workers, insisting they learn from each other. Captain Holbrook had retired from military service in 1950 and had maintained friendships with several of the women who stayed. She attended Hisako's restaurant opening, Sumiko's wedding, and Masako's naturalization ceremony.